Hi everyone, Jason Dunham here. I'm an aquatic ecologist with the US Geological Survey, Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center located in Corvallis, Oregon. And I'm going to give a presentation entitled Getting RAD with Biological Invasions in a Rapidly Changing World. It's going to be a fishy perspective. This was a talk that was at least partially recorded for the July 21st, 2022 meeting of the Northwestern Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. That recording didn't go through all the way, so I'm re-recording it today. So thanks for being here. And we'll jump right into the invasion process. Most folks listening to this presentation probably know this well, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, on the left-hand side here, we've got one depiction of how the process itself works. So we have a species that may be present in a donor region, so it's not native to that region, but it could arrive there through some means of transport or dispersal. That's the next step of the second arrow below. And eventually establish and perhaps spread through a donor region and cause impacts. And when they're not desirable, then it's known as an invasive species. On the right-hand side, you've got a number of management responses that sort of correspond with the different stages of the invasion process. And I've highlighted a few of these, what I call conventional approaches here that are often used in practice today. And managing through the process, these conventional approaches include EDRR, that's early detection and rapid response. That is currently a big deal, and it makes sense. We want to stop these problems before they get started. So it's preventative, it's proactive, and makes sense for species like in this region, dracynid mussels, so zebra and quagga mussels that have not yet become established in many places. Northern pike is another good example that folks pointed out to me during my original presentation. But some of those species do slip through the net, and they become established, and so we need to often consider control of them, removal or other means of control. And this is usually successful in smaller, more isolated habitats. And in these larger, more open connected systems, it requires sort of persistent efforts to reduce a species distribution or abundance, and pretty much forever. It's really hard to kind of deal with them in big open situations like that. So these are invaders that are truly out of control, and we have to live with them. And are there ways to manage species in this case? And I'm going to turn now to focus on a different approach, and it's not managing the species itself, but managing the impacts. So I've termed this in a 2020 paper in Wires Water, I termed this MIM, or Managing Impact Modifiers. And there are 4 conditions that we argue need to be true for this to be a viable decision alternative for managing these late stage invasions. So this is late in the process. You can see that highlighted in the yellow highlighted square there in the management response associated with the invasion process on the left. So condition number 1, conventional management responses, that is prevention or control to limit the invader, are not feasible. Condition number 2, there has to be variation in the undesirable impacts of an established invader. So if you saw Donovan Bell's presentation preceding mine in this particular meeting for the RISCC, he showed that there are variable impacts of invaders when you're looking at native trout up in the crown of the continent. Number 3, factors influencing this variability are understood, and at least enough to develop testable hypotheses for adaptive management. So in a lot of ways, this managing impacts approach is a little bit more information intensive than alternatives. Control doesn't necessarily require that you need to know a lot about what's going on with the species. You just need to get rid of them, or in terms of prevention, stopping them from becoming an issue. But here we need to learn about relationships and how to manage them. And number 4, of course, if there is variability in these factors and we have an idea what they are, they need to be manageable so that we can potentially influence impacts. Otherwise, there's no reason to do this if there's nothing to manage. If you want more details, that's kind of the nutshell, but there's a couple of recent papers, mine in Wires Water in 2020, and then there's another review paper in Bioscience the year after by Garcia Diaz et al. Talking about management policies for species using these types of approaches. And I encourage you to check both these papers out. Mine is more focused on fish, but relates to the general example. The Bioscience paper talks about a much broader range of cases. So that's the invasive species side of this. How does this link to RAD? What is RAD? RAD is the resist, accept, direct concept. It provides language and concepts for managing change. And here what I'm talking about today is ecological transformation. So look at the left-hand side of the slide. You'll see a nice little figure from a paper by Gregor Skirman et al. And a recent issue of Bioscience has a whole bunch of cool papers on the RAD concept, all open access. So I encourage you to go check that out if you're interested for more details. But here we're looking at transformation over time. It can be sort of slow and incremental, fast, or sometimes really abrupt. And we have kind of seen this in this region in response to climate change and biological invasions as well, both agents of ecological transformation. So how do we fold these together in a management context? And before we get there, I have a case study to show you, but before we get there, let's dive into a few more details of what's in the RAD framework. So the R in RAD is resist, and this refers to management approaches that resist that trajectory of change or transformation by working to maintain or restore ecosystem composition, what's in there, structure, how it's arranged, processes, how it works or function, on the basis of historical or acceptable current conditions. So bring it back to the way it was or kind of the way it is now and try to keep it there. The A in RAD is accept. This refers to just accepting that trajectory of change or transformation and just allow things to kind of happen on their own and stay out of the way. And sometimes that is a reasonable decision alternative. The third letter in RAD is the D. That is direct. So this is management aimed at sort of changing that trajectory, directing it by actively shaping where it's going in terms of outcomes for the ecosystem and trying to bring it into a new set of preferred conditions. It's not the way it was, it's not the way it is, but it's better than just kind of letting it change without any intervention. Now I'm going to turn to a fairly recent example of what this might look like. So kind of operationalizing these RAD concepts in concert with ways that we think about managing invasive species. And I'm going to play on the native versus introduced trout example that Dunham and Bell brought up in his presentation. We're going to look at introduced brook trout. Here in the West, brook trout are widespread invaders. They are native to the East Coast where they are a conservation problem within their native range. But here we've got a lot of brook trout. We'd like to maybe give some back to the East Coast. Control of the species is really challenging. They're very widespread. About 70% of Oregon's alpine lakes are stocked with brook trout or have been stocked with brook trout. So they're everywhere. People like them, so in some places they don't want us to try to control them. But they do have impacts on native species like bull trout. These are both the same genus, Salvelinus. And those impacts are also highly variable. So a little hint there that maybe the MIM approach could be useful. And the question I want to get at here, which we pose in our paper, is resist in the RAD framework. Is resist the only option, trying to just basically control brook trout or prevent them from invading? So to kind of bring this down into an application, we looked at the RAD concept and we tried to link that to what we know to be common decision alternatives for managing these two species. We identified 4 resist alternatives. The first is to install a movement barrier to isolate native species like bull trout upstream of the invasion. This is a very common thing you'll see throughout the western United States, where there is a barrier, and above that are only native species, and below are the non-native or introduced species. The second option is to eradicate brook trout, in this case, early in the invasion. So maybe we just start to detect them. There's not that many around, and we just kind of nip it in the bud early if we get lucky and detect the invasion at that stage, which is often not the case. Later in the invasion, brook trout are usually pretty well established, and that comes down to two options: partial control or really go for it and try to completely eradicate brook trout, which takes quite an effort if you are familiar with any of the case studies where they've been able to do that, particularly in these larger systems, like I mentioned before. We identified 3 accept decision alternatives. The first one is to do nothing, not take action, and let that trajectory do its thing. A second is to increase cold water availability. So we call this accept because we're not doing anything to the brook trout, but we are changing that physical system. So you could increase supply of water to the channel, maybe riparian shading or some other means of trying to get to cold water. A lot of streams that have that opportunity, that management lever available to them in this region. So in addition to that, we looked at increasing migratory life history expression in native, so bull trout. So bull trout, when they have access to other places where they can feed and grow large, they'll do it. And in a lot of parts of the range, they don't have access to those habitats anymore. And allowing bull trout to get big and burly, come back, females bringing more eggs back to their natal stream, and also being at a potentially greater competitive advantage by virtue of being larger. This can really allow them to better coexist with non-native brook trout. So these are the 3 accept options that we identified. And the third is a direct option. We just had one, and this is assisted migration or managed relocation. Basically, we're talking about moving bull trout from where they are native into a suitable but unoccupied habitat within their existing range, or maybe on the outside of that, depending on the flavor of relocation you want to look at. But there are places definitely around on the landscape where the species could potentially take a foothold and there are no brook trout. So maybe move them there. And you might argue that these different RAD components overlap a little bit and don't perfectly align with the decision alternatives for invasive species like we've identified here, but this is the best we could do. We thought it was a pretty useful distinction. So how do we look at this? We employed a 2-species population model to model out trajectories in the future. This is based on past work with myself and Joe Benjamin and others looking at interactions between brook and bull trout. And we've done this in several different places. And you can read the paper for the details. I won't burden you with those today. I'll just take my word for it here. But looking at all these RAD alternatives that we identified for this 2-species system, we found that there was a resist option that produced a slight increase in population of bull trout and eradication of brook trout. So that was complete eradication early in the invasion, so that EDRR approach was successful. For accept, there were 2 alternatives that worked. One was increasing cold water, the other one was increasing migratory expression in bull trout, so both MIM options. And the migratory expression one worked particularly well, resulting in a fairly significant increase in the population of bull trout, and not much of a change in brook trout, although there was a noticeable decline in the migratory option. For direct, that could work as well based on these model trajectories, and we observed a slight increase in numbers of bull trout over time as a result of implementing that decision. Okay, so what are the management implications from this? I kind of just went over them, but one important bottom line is that each RAD class, resist, accept, or direct, produce successful outcomes for bull trout. And in practice, at least in my experience, resist is really common in practice, and accept or direct is less common, but they do work. So it rhymes. RAD is not just a fad. So I would say think about this if you run into a similar problem, something that's analogous to what we talked about for brook and bull trout. This isn't just about these species, but the general approach. And in the paper, which is on the right-hand side there, just published in Fisheries Management Ecology, we also engaged a social scientist, Kitty Clifford, to talk about the social pieces of this as well. It's not just an ecological problem. It does require social and ecological engagement because there's a lot of new ideas here and folks aren't always really comfortable or trusting of them, but it does seem like they can produce results. So I'm not going to take questions today because there is no audience. I'm in my spare bedroom in my house, but I just want to leave you with a quote by Albert Einstein. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking, and I think that's what RAD is all about. If you do have a question, there's my email in the bottom of the slide, so you can just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to get back to you, send you a copy of the paper, or questions, criticisms, whatever you have are very welcome. And thank you very much for listening today. Cheers.